So this was addressed to me by a friend asking, it says one of my other questions was, you mentioned if so and so had read earlier works, please suggest reading this where I would learn that history. I feel dumb for asking, but if it were my profession, I'd know exactly where to look for certain pieces of information. This church history is a maze for me. Uh, yeah, it's that's the cool thing, is that it kind of is, but it's the most immediate access for people, and that's what I like. I like things being accessible to everybody, which is why I'm not a Gnostic. Uh, is early Christian writings, and I'll put a link in the description box, and please check that out. Now, I don't agree with the dates on the certain, they have dates next to each writing, right? Let me just go there and and they have these hypotheticals: the Passion narrative, the lost sayings of Q, the Signs Gospel. These are non-existent. I mean, even the scholars will say they're non-existent. They're hypothetical. But as you look through this, I mean, many of the New Testament scholars that are not Christian and don't hold a high view of Christianity don't put Mark later than AD 69. They just don't. But you have all the way up to Origin. And I don't know, there's probably, let me guess, there's maybe about 50, 150, 200 writers here. And there's, for a lot of these, there's more than one writing. And you can see the history. And then if you go and you look, okay, well, what's the earliest stuff that we find? The manuscript evidence. The earliest manuscript evidence is of either canonical, meaning it's in the 27-book canon that we have today, or more Catholic stuff, like the Proto-Evangelium of James. The first reference to the virgin birth that we have in, archaeology or manuscript evidence, whatever you want to categorize that as, is actually the Proto-Evangelium of James, which later on the Catholics would point to in the 19th century as evidence for, the Immaculate Conception. But Epistle of Barnabas, First Clement, Ignatius of Antioch, the Didache is crazy early. Even the harshest skeptics put it earlier than the Gospels. And if you look at the Didache, this is one of the amazing things for me, is that you look at the Didache and you open up an Antiochian book of, the prayers. It's identical. Pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. You do the Trisagion Prayer 3 times a day. What days do you fast? Wednesday and Friday, just like it says in the Didache. And the Didache was a missing document for a while. There was an expansion called the De Silica, but of the pure Didache, that was lost for a period of time. But it wasn't lost because we've been practicing every single last thing in the Didache for the longest time. I mean, there's a real stress on, the Gnostics. The Gnostics bear themselves out, even in the Nag Hammadi library, if you read it, to be anti-procreation, anti-sex, anti-physical world. So this idea of, we're going to go dance around in nature, and nature bears the witness of God, and sex is good, unlike the Catholics. Well, actually, the Catholics argued sex is good, and so is marriage. And the supposedly Catholic forgeries of the New Testament, like the pastoral epistles, enshrine sex and procreation as a part of Christianity. So they needed to be in there. But when when Tertullian and Irenaeus argue against the Gnostics, or at least they talk about dissolving the nuptial bond, because I mean, We have Thecla, right? We remember her. But we don't have the Acts of Paul. They're thought to be spurious. They're too ascetic. The Gnostics were die-hard ascetics, and you can see that in their writing. They didn't like femaleness. Femaleness was the begetting of children and the womb, the matrix that bears, the physical. They didn't. That was the tomb of the soul. That was you're entombing the soul in this horrid flesh. Uh, the idea was to escape it. Salvation wasn't through love. You weren't you didn't reach God by loving one another. You cut all family ties, just like Ramtha or Falun Gong or any of this other stuff. You had to cut ties with everybody in the physical world. This is why some of the more things that we see as radical, Christ saying, like you must hate your mother and father, they took to the nth degree. They didn't see it as, oh, hate being the opposite of love, but love being pragmatic. So no, first comes God, that because a lot of people is, their fathers would send in the war, direct them to kill a slave or whatever. But they took it as, nope, we're going to do this. And every single one of the Gnostic Gospels, you do not find early. I mean, the Nag Hammadi. The Nag Hammadi library comes from the 4th century, for Christ's sake. And that's my problem with people trying to read, well, what's a good book to read about early Christianity? Well, none of them. Because they all make up your minds for you. People quote Elaine Pagels on Gnosticism. Go check out James F. Pandira's box, what he has to say about Elaine Pagels or whatever, because they're trying to make Gnosticism more palatable. They don't like the fact that it's ascetic, male, and elitist, because that's how they've always tried to paint Catholicism. And again, I don't mean, modern Catholicism. In fact, I believe modern Catholicism, modern papal Western Latin Catholicism actually adopted Gnosticism, actually wound up becoming and having a lot of Gnostic attributes with the rise of the Dominican order, because they were born out of battle in the Albigensians. So they started to mirror what they acted like. Their quote-unquote piety, their celibacy, their not speaking, these things. It's crazy. The Catholic Church was not big on monasteries or monks. They did not allow that crap until after Anthony the Great. It took somebody like him for the church to say, all right, the celibate men going out into the desert, pray, that's fine. Even of the Acts, the works of the Acts, not just the Gospels, but the Acts. What's the earliest Acts? The Acts of the Apostles. The other ones come later. No scholars are going to tell you that the other Acts are older than the Acts of the Apostles. Same thing with the Gospel. Oh, well, Thomas might be earlier. The sayings of sayings Gospel of Thomas. Well, as John Dominic Carson and Marvin Mars both have pointed out, the improvements from Matthew and Luke of this Q are found in Thomas, so it is relying. And then when it comes to the end, where it's got this anti-female thing, this misogynistic line, they say, oh, that was an original. Well, if you've got only fragments of what could be the Gospel, the sayings Gospel of Thomas, which date to the late 3rd century, and your only complete copy, or even readable copy, is from, the late 4th, early 5th century, how do you know what was original and what wasn't? So, I mean, it's, if you start just simply reading, like, Ignatius Didache, Barnabas, First Clement, Ignatius of Antioch, First Clement's kind of a bore, sorry, Polycarp to the Corinthians, and then you go on to dealing with people like Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, and also a lot of it has to do with studying these things. And yeah, you can look at scholars and what they say, but just take their word for things, I don't suggest people do that at all. Read some of or read books independently, like read Romans and think, what would be the conclusion that you'd come to with just this? I mean, you could see how antinomianism would break out with Galatians. Uh, I'll suggest my two-parter on Marcion. Put together that Marcion's father was a priest from Pontus, which is right next to Galatia, and there was and in Galatians it Paul is addressing a group that was evangelized by Judaizers, and then Paul comes along and says, how could you have departed from this? Marcion's thing was, we've been given a Judaized gospel, and now we have to go back to the original Pauline thing. And his father might have been one of those guys who, in middle age, had to circumcise themselves, and had to obey Jewish law. And maybe some of them died during persecution. And they find out we're considered apostates now. So that's a lot of things. You wind up gaining more and more light to it, but those who sell books and who are on a lot of these documentaries, and remember, documentaries are for entertainment. You come out and say, well, Gnosticism was a later 2nd and 3rd century invention that despised sex, didn't like women, and were a bunch of elitist men that went out into the desert. Well, that's the stereotype they have of Roman Catholics. It's pretty anticlimactic. That's kind of a bummer, but if you paint them as these pagans who God is in everybody, that's not. The Gnostics thought they held seeds of the light that the Pleroma let down and were lost. Not necessarily that everybody was. And they were the sectarians too. They broke off. They were the ones, spewing all this anger towards everybody else. The Catholic meant universal. I mean, reading the Jewish Wars by Josephus. That's not going to hurt you. That could help your view of history. But it's also good as well as to juxtapose things like learn what the ancient Roman gods were, which I think everyone has a pretty good overview of that. Although I say that and then I stumble across people who think that the ancient Romans were monotheists or something like that. But yeah, it's the more information you read that's from the time, the better view you get of it. And then also look at parallels in modern times where we have a better, a more recent, more expansive view of it. Like when the Protestant Reformation came around, there was another upsurge of Docetism, with people saying, well, the flesh is nothing, and we're just saved by magic words, basically, or gnosis, or it basically was gnosis. These, we're saved by the fact that we know we're saved, and we have faith, and this and that. You had people who abhorred sex and who were very Puritan, and then even more so, to the point of being totally celibate and demanding celibacy from everybody. And then you had groups like the ranchers who would get drunk and have as much sex as they wanted because it didn't matter. Works don't mean anything. I'm saved by faith alone, so it's you do have to work your way through it. I mean, it's 15 years for me, but again, I don't ever condemn anybody for ignorance. It's only when people come on and say, well, obviously, or there's no evidence for Christianity. The first writings of even the first copy of the New Testament don't come to us until the 8th century. That's when I get snarky with people. Or when they say, oh, Catholic, that's just a blending of paganism and the real message of Yeshua. Why isn't his name Yehoshua? Where do you find Yeshua in any early documents? As if Aramaic was something sacred. Do they not know that Aramaic came from Babylon? And that there were people with Greek names in the New Testament? I mean, I point this out to people. I'm not again, the person that asked me this, he's one of my favorite people in the world. And has a pure heart of orthodoxy, but yeah, when they hear orthodoxy, they think, oh, rigid stuff, and they think Puritan, which, I mean, how much further from Puritanism could orthodoxy be? Gnostics were like the Puritans. And again, half the time, well, most of the time on here, when I find someone calling themselves a Gnostic, it's like you say, it's the greasy-haired, slick-talking, saying nothing hippie that's just mean-spirited, actually, inside, like that one sociopath narcissist that I ran into, the Gnostic Truth. You know? Their view of the world is basically the Matrix, with no compassion for anybody else. Everyone else is an enemy because they're under the demiurge. They're just stupid. Everybody else is ignorant. We're enlightened. Anything in the Nag Hammadi library can show you these were not compassionate. They didn't care for the poor, and they were not martyrs. Even James at Pandora's Box will emphasize the fact that the Gnostics did not have martyrs. They didn't believe in dying for what they believed in, because it was secret knowledge. It wasn't your works or your acts, or, you know, for us it's not based on works, but we do bear fruit. We can meet Christ mystically when we help the poor and the sick and the dying. With the Gnostics, that's all just baggage. That's shit that ties you to the world. Fuck the guy that's hungry. He's only hungry because he wants something physical. That asshole, he just needs to be liberated, but he's too stupid. That's honestly their view. That's why they compassion doesn't factor into it. You have to, it's secret knowledge that lets you escape, and you know, they're lucky enough to get the secret knowledge. You know, what was one thing? Oh, this stupid program said, you know, the Gnostic Gospels, you know, the New Testament tells us that Jesus is the only Son of God, whereas the Gnostic Gospels tell us that we could all become sons of God. Well, that's a straw man, because the New Testament says we can all become sons and daughters of God because Christ was the Son of God. And there's no Gnostic anywhere, not any historical Gnostics, and none of them from the Nag Hammadi, that wouldn't fully affirm that Christ was the only begotten of the Father, or at least him and Sophia, but he was the Logos, he was the Son of God. He never became the Son of God. That's in quasi-Catholic writings that were deemed heretical, but were not in any way Gnostic. Infancy Gospel of Thomas isn't Gnostic at the slightest. Yeah, it's not stupidity not to know this stuff. It's not wrong to be ignorant of things. It's only stupidity when you assert, this is the truth, and I know it because I heard a rumor. Just how these jackasses operate, you know? They're just the biggest elitists. I like when people ask me questions and they have absolutely no clue. I do that too. That's how you learn. You know, it's for somebody like me that actually struggled through these works, you know, from for the last 15 years. I really go after the people that get all uppity and arrogant about stuff, or who try to declare things, you know, definitively when it's, well, you know, you've known me for a few years now. It's you see what the Gnostics are like. Have you met one Gnostic that had charity or compassion or honestly just love for human beings? Or were they the most selfish people on earth? And James at Pandora's Box, his views are good. The views that he has are good because, or of the ones that he has that are good, because he wound up basically becoming orthodox but won't admit it. Alright, take it easy. Peace to you.